Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this December 9, 2014 edition of Nightcast. The last French hostage has been freed in Mali. That's our opening story for tonight, friends. The man you see in the photograph behind me, let's go ahead and bring it forward here. Serge Lazarevic in the center picture, and Philippe Verdun were kidnapped in 2011. The last French hostage to be held by Islamic militants has been freed after 3 years, French President François Hollande announced today. Serge Lazarevic was snatched in Mali in November 2011 along with fellow Frenchman Philippe Verdun. Militants from the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb AQIM group killed Mr. Verdun last year in retaliation for France's intervention in Mali. Mr. Hollande said that there were no more French hostages waiting to be freed. Mr. Lazarevic, he said, was in relatively good health despite the conditions of his captivity and was on his way to the neighboring county of Niger, from where he would return to France. AQIM kidnapped a number of Western hostages before the French military deployed its forces against the group in January 2013, January last year. There were at one point at least 14 French nationals being held by Islamists in West Africa. There are no more French hostages in any country in the world, Mr. Hollande said. He thanked the authorities in Niger and Mali who had, quote, worked towards this happy outcome, end quote. Sounds good, but, everything's not all over yet. There's more in this news story, though, friends. There have been no details about how the release of Mr. Lazarevic was secured. The French government, and that's curious, actually, at that point, no details about how the release of Mr. Lazarevic was secured. It makes you want to ask the question, well, what has France committed itself to? Which, in all logic, you'd have to say, well, there's got to be some advantage to the Islamic militants for them to let go of the last French hostage. France has agreed to something, perhaps under the table, and they've this deal with this bunch of bandit terrorists. The French government has repeatedly denied paying ransoms for hostages. This news story. There's one more photograph to this story, and the caption for this photograph reads, Serge Lazarevic, shown in a still and AQIM video, was held over 3 years. The caption for this reads, just a little bit more in this story, friends. During his captivity, Mr. Lazarevic appeared in several AQIM videos. Again, this photograph you're seeing here is a frame from one of those videos. There was concern for the 50-year-old father's health in November after he was filmed pleading for his release. He looked frail in the video and was filmed alongside a second hostage, Dutchman Sajak Rizik, it's not clear where the two men were held or whether they were held together. Mr. Rizik was kidnapped in November 2011 while visiting the city Timbuktu as a tourist. There has been no news from him since the video. And friends, I promised you last night that I would tell you what German Foreign Minister Steinmeier was in the news regarding yesterday. Let me just check something here. Got another photograph. Okay, comes out like that. Okay, same thing, only I got a blue background behind this one. German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He gave what's been called a great power speech to big business. In his opening speech at the, let's see, I think I have something mistyped here. I've got the SZ, but it must be a number. It must be the S7 Economic Summit. German Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier appealed to business heads to support Germany's rise to be a world power. This story, friends, is by Johannes Stern from the Global Research publication just 2 days ago, December 7, 2014. In its opening speech at the SZ Economic Summit, German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, I have a horse named after him, by the way, because I was expecting some big things from this man. And he has appealed in that speech in the summit to business heads to support Germany's rise to be a world power. Friends, I'm going to repeat that. In his speech before the SZ Economic Summit, German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier appealed to business heads to support Germany's rise to be a world power. The meeting did not take place in the Dusseldorf Park Hotel, but in Berlin's Hotel Adlon. Sitting in the audience was not Fritz Eisen and Gustav Knapp von Bohlen and Halbeck, but ThyssenKrupp CEO Heinrich Hiesinger and other current heads of German big business. And of course, the Social Democratic Party Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier is not Adolf Hitler, this story by Johannes reads. Nevertheless, Steinmeier's appearance recalled Hitler's speech to the Dusseldorf Industry Club on January 26, 1932. Like the soon-to-become Führer, Steinmeier made a direct appeal to German big business to support Germany's rise to be a world power. He explicitly called on big business to support him and the government in pushing through a militarist foreign policy turn against the will of the people. Friends, you know, Mr. Armstrong told us to watch for 3 elements to develop in Europe in the coming together of what the Bible calls a beast power, which has at its head an emperor who is given its power by the 10 toes. 5 toes from the East Division of the Roman Empire, 5 toes from the West Division of the Roman Empire. And both the feet and toes of both feet are described being made of iron and miry clay, common clay. And, you know, iron and clay don't mix, and that's the point. They won't get along, these 10 nations, 5 from the east, 5 from the west. Within their groups of 5 from the east, they won't get them. And the groups of 5 from the west, they won't get along either, because that clay and iron is on both feet. And so within each group of 5, they won't get along, and then the two, opposing, the one from the east, one from the west, they won't get along. It's just a whole mix, but there will be some event, big enough to trigger it. But let me explain what those 3 elements, I've explained this before, but let's repeat them here. What Mr. Armstrong said we should be watching for in the coming together of this EU, and help it to snap together when 3 elements come together. One was economically. We've been seeing that happen since 2000, when the euro was taken from just being a payment system of bookkeeping to actual use of the euro. Printed, circulated, the whole 9 yards. And they had some struggles, as you know, with it, but they've managed, and some thought that would topple it, those struggles they've had, and causing some countries that are part of the Eurozone to go through what has been termed austerity, really tightening their belts as they try to get their debt ratio, their ratio of debt to gross national product in line. It has to stay below 3%. The debt has to stay below 3% of the gross domestic product of each country. Now, so they struggle, and they've and as a result, you'll learn from this story by Johannes how the economic factor has helped Germany to just spread its way by giving aid and low interest rate loans to a lot of the countries that were in trouble. And so that enabled Germany to wiggle its way in the different countries giving aid, low interest rate loans, and he who rules the gold rules. So putting Germany largely on top and causing people to forget about World War I and World War II, and how Germany, in wanting to be a world power, it pulls, no holds barred, pulls all the stops, and will be relentless. And even God says when he uses modern-day Assyria, which is Germany today, when he uses modern-day Assyria to punish his people Israel, when his people, the tribes of Israel, refuse to acknowledge God, refuse to obey him, when they disobey, God says, okay, captivity time and punishment time. I will do it again through the Assyrians. Then I'll have to punish the Assyrians because they'll do the job a whole lot bigger, a whole lot than what I desired them to do. They take it too much to heart. They have fun with the punishment. I looked for Associate Justice Judge George Danielson after he had been appointed by former President Nixon to be the judge over the Artukovic trials, the old German Artukovic trials. And part of my job while working for that justice, he had been appointed by Reagan to be an associate justice for the California court system. And in his elder years, just before retirement, I was hired to work for him through an agency, and I worked for him until he retired. And part of my job was to make copies and organize those files from the Artukovic trial. He wanted his own personal copies of those and copy them and sort them out for him. And in sorting them out, I had to read them. And some of the things I read about that the Germans would do to people that aren't too well known, aren't published that much. I remember one that really turned me on my head, and this was just one of several incidents I would read about, was when there was a very vivid description of them cutting open a pregnant woman, taking a baby and killing, and then, now listen, some of you ladies may want to stop up your ears for a moment, and then putting that baby back in the mother and set her back up with the baby they had just killed now inside the mother. Now, that was a gross kind of abortion, you might say, because they put the dead baby back inside the mother, sewed her back up. If your mind can imagine forward what would happen with a baby decaying and dying inside, it made me sick. And perhaps, I hope some of you stopped your ears if it made you too sick as you heard that. But that's the kind of thing the modern day Assyrian people can do, who God says he will use, and then God already knows they'll do it. They'll go far again, and he's already said in his word that he will then punish them once they've been too cruel upon his people, Israel. But in knowing that and in telling us about that, friends, that should put some fire under some of us who've maybe been lackadaisical and say, you say, Father, I'm going to do what you ask. I'm going to pray, thy kingdom come. I'm going to watch world news, pay attention to it, and when I see people hurting and crying and suffering here and there, I'm going to pray for them, put more of my teeth and more of my guts into my prayer and more of my heart into the prayer, praying, thy kingdom come. And then be accounted worthy to escape the tribulation to come. But while we're kind of breaking from this story for a moment, there's a little bit more on it from this story. Let's put our chart up just for a minute, because my having mentioned these seals from Revelation, the things that we're supposed to be watching, the things related to these first 4 seals in Revelation 6, the 5th seal hasn't come about yet. So even though Christ included that in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and especially Luke 21 is in verse 36 there in Luke 31, where he gave us the instruction to watch and pray about these things. And what things? The things he had been describing were the white horse deception. Many will come in my name saying that I am the Christ, that Jesus, in fact, was the Christ, and yet they'll deceive many. So you got false religions, false Christ, false prophets coming. Seal number 1, depicted in Revelation as a white horse, which Jesus Christ described in plain language in the way I just mentioned. The second seal, depicted in Revelation as a red horse, Jesus Christ described in plain language as war and rumors of war and nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, world war, which Germany led the way with the first round between 1914 and 1919, then a recess until 1945. Till 1939, 1940. Until 1945 was World War II. And just round 2 of World War, and we're in a recess now awaiting round 3 to fire up. Third column over, depicted in Revelation as a black horse, which is described there as a scarcity of food. Jesus Christ said simply it's time of famine. The fourth seal in Revelation is depicted as a horse, in fact, is depicted as a pale-colored horse with a rider on it whose name is Death, and it describes this rider and this horse, this pale horse, and its rider named Death as having alongside it, at the heels of it, riding along with it at its heels, Hades, hell, the grave. And then Jesus Christ described the primary activities of this horse as loimos, disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt. And he also said that during that time period of the 4th seal, between the 3rd seal and the 5th seal, we would see seismic activity, seismic conditions, commotions in the air, gale force winds of all kinds, commotions on the ground, earthquakes and the like, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, wildfires, floods, etc., etc. And Christ also said that during that same time period of the 4th seal, there would be terike, disturbances, trouble, literally troubled waters, both literally and figuratively as mobs and seditions, and just trouble, but not the mega trouble, which is the description for the 5th seal, which Jesus Christ called in plain language in Matthew 24, verse 21, the time of the great tribulation, which is what mega trouble means. Mega, great, trouble, tribulation. Great trouble, mega trouble, great tribulation. Jesus, and it being described in the Bible as a time of Jacob's trouble, Christ saying there's been no time since the beginning of the world that's going to be as bad as what will happen during the Great Tribulation, nor ever will be, meaning it will never again be as bad as what's going to happen during the Great Tribulation, thankfully so. And so there's just a quick scan of the first 5 of the 7 seals of Revelation, the 5th one being not yet in happening, but that's the next major event in prophecy we're going to see when that 5th seal opens up, when the Great Tribulation opens up, and there's a crowning of an emperor who the Bible calls a beast, who will be the 7th and final head of the revived Holy Roman Empire. It'll be the time of round 3 of World War. It'll be a time of Jacob's trouble. It will be a time of a tremendous and great martyrdom of God's saints. And there was a small martyrdom, as Fox's Book of Martyrs describes in the past. That was just a small type of what's coming in major, grandiose scale with the 5th seal. All right, friends, and having mentioned that, now I'm going to take us back to the story that I was reading to you about regarding Frank Walter Steinmeier's speech. Steinmeier, his program strongly recalled the German lust for power, once believed to be a thing of the past. Germany should lead Europe to lead the world, Europeanize Russia, and multilateralize the U.S., Steinmeier demanded, citing an essay that has been featured on an official website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for months. Now, before I tell you what he added, let me just repeat that, because I kind of stumbled over that just a little bit, friends. Steinmeier's program strongly recalls the German lust for power, once believed to be a thing of the past. And here's what he said. Germany should lead Europe to lead the world, Europeanize Russia, and militarialize the U.S. Militarialize the U.S., Steinmeier demanded, citing an essay that has been featured on an official website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for months. And has the United States taken any alarm over that braggadocio that, hey, you know, we should be a greater military power than the U.S. We should put down the United States military. We should have a thumb over it. Be a military power over the U.S. The article goes on to say, why am I laughing about that? I'm sorry, Ken, that's not fun. That isn't funny. And yet, what's ironic about it is that he can openly say this and be totally ignored by the great powers of the United States. That God says, if you don't obey me, you'll be under a curse. And you know, I saw a writing today from a friend of mine who said that the very administration that we now have in power over the U.S. is one of the curses God is giving this country. And you know, I couldn't argue with that. Again, back to this article. The implications of Steinmeier's words are, as Johans says in this article I'm reading to you, friends, says, are unmistakably Germany's return to an aggressive foreign policy that runs along similar channels as followed in the first half of the 20th century. The German elites once again see it as their task to dominate Europe in order to become a world power. Today, as before, this program of German imperialism means conflict with Russia and the United States. To Europeanize Russia means nothing other than to subordinate Russia to a Europe controlled by Germany. To militarialize the United States means to contest the role of the United States as the world hegemon. In other words, German foreign policy in the future will develop increasingly in opposition to the two powers against which it has already waged 2 world wars. After the crimes of the Nazi regime, Johann says, the German elites are, at least for now, still trying to present their program of a third grab for world power as if it were being imposed on them from the outside. Every day, the expectation of German involvement is encountered from our partners abroad, Steinmeier protested at the Adlon. He had therefore asked a large group of international experts to formulate their expectations of German foreign power. From the many responses he received to this request, Steinmeier highlighted just one, titled Germany's Destiny, Leading Europe in Order to Lead the World. This comes from the pen of the Indian-born professor Kishore Mahbubani of the National University of Singapore, located in an authoritarian one-party state. The text, together with other calls for a more aggressive German foreign policy, can be found on the website Review 2014 of the German Foreign Ministry of Mahbubani's key. I'm sorry, now I'm running that sentence together. Of Johann's rights. I'm reading his article to you, friends. Of Mahbubani's key demands, Steinmeier said tersely, and do you know who said that? Not a Frenchman, not an American, but an Indian professor wrote that for us. Steinmeier's speech was, as Johann says here, was remarkable not only for its call for German leadership in the world, it also expressed an openly imperialist program. At its core was the conclusion that in a world that is increasingly dominated by national conflicts, Germany's global interest can no longer be pursued by purely economic means, but must rely on foreign policy and military force. Now, friends, I'm pausing from the article there to go back to that sentence and bring out the 3 things I mentioned a moment ago that maybe I didn't finish that when I first was mentioning to you that Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong told us to be watching for 3 elements to develop in Europe that would tell us that the EU, not necessarily just the EU, but that would tell us that the uniting of Europe, the United States of Europe, was coming together in a federation that would be ready to spring its power from 10 either rebordered areas or 10 regions or 10 nations that it becomes whittled down to, who, as the Bible says, for an hour give their power to the beast. In other words, for a short time, they say one man has got the position whom the Bible will call a beast, and he'll be working in conjunction with the false prophet who will crown him in Frankfurt, Germany, in the Emperor's Hall. This is where it's always been done. When the 7th and final head of the Holy Roman Empire is crowned, it'll be done in a coronation ceremony that is always held in the Emperor's Hall, which is in Frankfurt, Germany. And that false prophet, that powerful religious figure who always does the crowning to an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, called holy because the world church power, a world church power is associated with the Holy Roman Empire, and as many of you well know, that's the Roman Catholic Church. No big secret at all. No big revelation either. It's well known. Revelation 12:9, right in front of our eyes. A verse in the Bible where God explains something going on that people seem to be blind to in a way. That tells us who's really behind the world's big religions. Let's just pause from this article for another moment. Read this one verse, and then I'll finish up the article, friends. This verse in Revelation 12, verse 9 says, "And the great dragon was cast out." And then God begins to explain who that great dragon is. He says that old serpent called the devil and Satan. That old serpent that was the serpent in the Garden of Eden who deceived Mother Eve. That old serpent called the devil and Satan, who deceiveth the whole world. Satan deceives the whole world? He didn't just pull one off on Mother Eve and that was the end of it? No, this verse says, who deceives the whole world. Now, friends, if the whole world is deceived, other than maybe just a few whom God calls out for a spring harvest, if otherwise, and that spring harvest, comparatively to the numbers of the world, is a small harvest. If you're a part of it, you may think, hey, I've been part of a big, huge church. Well, yeah, you were bigger than your local neighborhood Baptist church congregation, even if it was 1,000 or 1,200 people. Well, hey, we had 120,000. Yeah, but compared to the billions in the world, your little 120,000 to drop in the bucket. That's a small harvest, the spring harvest, always smaller than the fall harvest. And the rest of the world is, as this verse says, deceived by that old serpent called the devil and Satan. Well, now listen, if he's got the whole world deceived, how's he doing it? Is he using a religious system? And is that to deceive the whole world? Is that religious system a big, huge system? Well, yes, it is. There's a big, huge Roman Catholic system, and the Pope, who's made the human head of it, is doing the, what's the word to use? Doing the duties of that old dragon, the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. And he will, as he's done before, he will conduct the coronation ceremony, and unless the seventh and final head does as Napoleon does, gets impatient, can't wait for the Pope to put the crown on his head, and grabs it and snatches it out of the Pope's hand and puts it on his own head, unless that happens, the seventh and final head of the Holy Roman Empire will be crowned by the Pope in the Emperor's Hall in Frankfurt, Germany. Wouldn't you like to be there for that? Well, actually, maybe not. A lot of very powerful negative influences will likely be in that room. Maybe even Satan himself will be present in that room during that occurrence. That room, by the way, the Emperor's Hall, is up on the second floor of the City Hall building in the Romer building in Frankfurt, Germany. And the Romer building simply means the Roman building. Then all of that was rebuilt after World War II with good old American taxpayer money through the Marshall's Plan, because that area had been bombed by the Allies toward the end of World War II. But we rebuilt that for them. We rebuilt that so that where the coronation ceremony for the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, which is what the beast will be, he'll be an emperor, the seventh and final head of the emperorship of that Holy Roman Empire. And that's coming. That's coming. And Frank Walter Steinmeier here is talking about pushing things to where that can happen sooner than later. And the three elements, I'm sorry, friend, I got into a big diversion. The three elements that Mr. Armstrong told us to be watching for that would cause that thing to be able to spring together would be when there's three certain types of unions. The first being an economic union. When there's an economic union, since 2000, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned this point, when the euro was finally printed as paper money and some coinage, and not just circulated by bookkeeping function as in the manner it began for a year and a half under Helmut Kohl. And once it began to be circulated And that was his big dream for decades. And boom, in 2000, 2001, the money began to be circulated. Had some problems, but now that's resolving, and that euro is getting stronger and stronger, little by little, stronger and stronger. So an economic union, and they've made banking union policies that support that euro. The second thing was a political union. That's been desired for decades by many in Europe. And with the treaty that was signed that helped put together those nations that are part of the EU, and then there are more nations that are part of the EU than are part of that economic union. That economic union is in a certain way called the Eurozone. The countries that are part of the political union, the EU, who have converted their own country's currency over to the euro so that that country no longer uses its national currency that it was using for years and years and years and years, but instead uses the euro. They are part of the Eurozone. And there's not as many of those. I think it's 17 or 18 out of something like 27 or 28. I've kind of lost track lately of how many are in the EU itself. There's more countries in the EU than there are in the Eurozone, because there's some countries like the UK who have not converted their national currency over to the euro. The UK still uses its pound. So for some of you may already understand that, but it doesn't hurt you to hear it defined again. And some of you may not have understood, that's the difference between the Eurozone and the EU. Yeah, the Eurozone, there's less of them. It's just those countries that have converted their national currency over to the euro. And some have threatened to go back to their national currency when they had austerity put on them, but they haven't. And I'm sure Steinmeier and others would say, thankfully they haven't, because that's kept the euro continue to be alive. Germany giving aid and giving low interest rate loans has helped keep that euro going, and that euro is, the headquarters for the European Central Bank, which puts the controls over the banking union policy controls over that euro. It's also in Germany, and it happens to be, guess what city it's in? Same city where the Emperor's Hall is located, where the seventh and final head of the Holy Roman Empire will be coronated, will be crowned in a coronation ceremony. The ECB, the European Central Bank, is located, the headquarters, I'm talking about the headquarters, is located in Frankfurt, Germany. Again, Frankfurt, Germany being the location of the Emperor's Hall, where the emperors are crowned by the Pope. All right, I'm underscoring some things I hope you're getting, friends. The stage is set for this stuff to go. All right, I mentioned two of the three things Mr. Armstrong told us to watch for. Economic union, political union. They're getting that together. They've been getting that together. They got the treaty that establishes who does what and so on in the EU. So they got the economic union, the political union. The third thing, and this is what Steinmeier is starting to push for and toward, is that third thing Mr. Armstrong mentioned, a military union. Economic, political, military union. Mr. Armstrong told us to watch for those three things to shape up, to know that it's coming together and could snap in shape. Listen to this last sentence once again in this news story by Johannes. At its core was the conclusion that in a world that's increasingly dominated by national conflicts, Germany's global interest can no longer be pursued by purely economic means. There's the first of the three things Mr. Armstrong told us to watch to come together. An economic union. So this sentence says can no longer be pursued by purely economic means. He wants two more things to happen. Listen to the sentence. Are the other two things Mr. Armstrong told us to watch for? A political union and a military union. And the next part of the sentence says pursued by economic means, rely on foreign policy, that's political union, political policy, political union, and the third thing Mr. Armstrong mentioned, and military force, military union, military policy, military force. Those are the three things Mr. Armstrong told us to watch for, and Mr. Steinmeier put them in one sentence, saying at the beginning of his remarks, Steinmeier said that it was no accident that at the end of this turbulent year of 2014, well, I wanted to reread that sentence. Okay, here it is. At its core was the conclusion that in a world that is increasingly dominated by national conflicts, Germany's global interest can no longer be pursued by purely economic interest, but must rely on foreign policy and military force. Those three elements. At the beginning of his remarks, Steinmeier said that it was no accident that at the end of this turbulent year of 2014, he was opening this business congress with a decidedly foreign policy speech. In his entire political biography, he could not remember a time in which international crises in such great number, in so many places in the world of such different nature, are assailing us simultaneously, as in the case today. He's on top of things, and I hope you are. That makes a very good point. That's the way news is running today, friends. Just as he said, he could not remember a time in which international crises in such great number, in many places in the world of such different nature, are assailing us simultaneously, as in the case today. The German foreign minister, let me bring his picture forward just full screen once again here. The German foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, drew a picture of a global situation that is strongly reminiscent of the world before the Second World War, a world in which the struggle for influence and domination prevails. Crisis is the new normal. Clear cracks and divides come forward, and stare at the differences between states, peoples, and cultures. Even in dealing with our partner, especially the United States, the public debate is dominated by differences, not common ground. Economically, a return to stronger national borders could be seen following the financial and economic crisis of 2008. This development is a challenge both for economic and foreign policy. Two of the things Mr. Armstrong mentioned: economic policy or union, foreign policy or union. And Steinmeier underscored especially for Germany, he said. The recession of globalization threatened the export-driven economy, while the peak of contradictions undermined the tools of the diplomats. Steinmeier drew the conclusion that it was in the interest of big business to support a more aggressive foreign policy, even if it brought short-term economic disadvantages. The first step to recovery comes from the consciousness of those who knew that for us Germans, we cannot stand aloof from the crisis of the global order. Where we can, we politicians and leaders must rouse us Germans from any insular thinking. I'm going to put his picture forward as I quote him here, friends. I don't want you to think I'm saying that. This is Steinmeier now speaking. Where we can, we politicians and business leaders must rouse us Germans from any insular thinking and any feelings of comfort. Those who recognize this must also take the next step. And the most networked country, we depend on a peaceful and rule-based order in the world. and must also intercede for this. Now, friends, he's talking about, a peaceful, orderly thing, but, read between the lines when he says, but we also must intercede for this. There's the third part Mr. Armstrong told us to watch for: a military force, a military policy, a military union, military force. And Mr. Steinmeier went on to say that these things would have to be not only in Europe, but worldwide. And Steinmeier impressed upon the representatives of big business that the rise of Germany to a global power could not be achieved solely through the means of peaceful trade. Economic globalization alone does not guarantee political convergence. And more BMWs on the streets of Moscow and more VW plants in China's metropolitan areas do not necessarily lead to greater political common ground. So, friends, Mr. Steinmeier in that speech has been stressing the three things Mr. Armstrong mentioned. And in that last paragraph, he was just stressing the economic policy and the political common ground, political policy, political union. He went on to say, in finishing this up, friends, businesses must therefore take part in the sanctions imposed by the West Russia. The annexation of Crimea and its action in eastern Ukraine, Russia placed in question international law and rule-based order, and thus violated the foundations of both our security and also our well-being. The Western powers react with sanctions that also cause ourselves economic cost. Said the cost to a permanent endangered Europe were, however, far greater, and the sanctions were therefore also in the long-term interest of business, Steinmeier argued. And he goes on. At the same time, he stressed that the goal of the sanctions should not be economically subjugate Russia. That was extremely dangerous. Destabilized or even collapse Russia is for themselves and others the much greater risk. Whoever talks like that does European security disservice. Steinmeier added, those who say we're finished with them might be able to win applause from some quarters, but in fact, we will never be finished. Remember, at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, the Canadian foreign minister said at a meeting, we have now to decide whether Russia is a friend or foe, partner or opponent. I told him, in Canada, you could put the question this way perhaps. For Europe, Russia will always remain a very large neighbor, and it will either have a good or a bad influence on our development. That was a blatant jab at the United States. Steinmeier named Canada, but he was in fact criticizing Washington, which has taken the most aggressive in the conflict with Russia. As small imperialist neighbor, Canada supports U.S. foreign policy, prepared to risk an open military confrontation with Russia in order to bring about regime change in Moscow. For its part, Germany wants to put Russia on the defensive, but does not want the complete collapse of their bilateral economic relations. At the same time, it is not yet ready to openly confront the United States, but it is beginning to pursue its imperialist interest more independently and more self-assuredly against other powers. Steinmeier left no doubt that, as in the past, this includes the use of military force and war. The third element that Mr. Armstrong told us to watch for developing in Europe that could bring this 10-nation beast to full front. Going on with Mr. Steinmeier's concluding quotes, he said, to combat the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, he said, of course, the military solution is a part, and we do not shirk from this. In the summer, we decided to support the fight by sending arms to the Kurdish Peshmerga, while the principle not to send weapons into areas of crisis still held. Foreign policy consists of considering many non-perfect options, and in such cases one must have regard to whether one is upholding principles or rather hiding behind them. Steinmeier's entire speech makes clear that the ruling elites in Germany are no longer willing to hide behind any principles or restrictions that they had to accept after defeat in World War II. They are preparing to impose the new foreign policy program on the German people. At the conclusion of Steinmeier's remarks, he referred to a survey by the Korber Foundation, which asked Germans whether Germany should engage more strongly than before internationally. Only 38% answered yes. 60% said no. Please continue to hold back. The foreign minister commented as follows: this is the gap between external expectations and internal readiness, ladies and gentlemen, with which I have to deal. Steinmeier speaking. To be honest, if I were an engineer, I would in good conscience not build a bridge over such a gulf. As a politician, I have to, and I would be happy if I was mistaken in my presentation. It is in your interest if German business assist a little. And he concluded, many thanks. What Steinmeier is proposing is an alliance of the state and big capital against the population is overwhelmingly hostile to the new course of war, the new war course. Such an alliance, combining the rich and the powerful against the majority, is deeply democratic. He says, after the terrible experience of 2 world wars, opposition to war is deeply rooted, especially in Germany. Nevertheless, the ruling elites have decided to return to a policy of war and impose this on the population. When Steinmeier had finished, there was thunderous applause in the ballroom of the Hotel Adlon. And friends, that's it for our extended version of Nightcast tonight, this Tuesday evening. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow night, Wednesday evening, with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy. And I will have something tomorrow night I'm looking into. Tomorrow we will talk about the EU having reached a deal on the 2015 budget, and we'll discuss the EU budget, where the money goes. We'll do that. We'll plan to do that, God willing, tomorrow night, Wednesday night, here on Nightcast. Until next time, friends, your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.